the origin of the Western domain out of the mythos of personality. So I'm following Alan McFarlane's advice to simply expatiate extemporaneously rather than to assemble a forensic case out of readings in the manner of a student in their 30s or so, who hasn't yet come into their stride. McFarlane's idea is that what happens is the grad students, when they have to write, are trained to assemble the meager evidences they've gotten from their current readings and then make a strong forensic case out of that. And on the whole, it's a mechanical operation, and at best, the nicest papers follow something like the high school thesis statement type of deal, and then some evidences and stuff. And then when you get into your 30s, you're still doing that, and then at some point you have to acquire your paideia properly, which means you can move on your own, and then rather than constantly looking at what are the models and what are the evidences they've supplied, but the real freedom of thought comes from just going with the path. So we'll see how far we can get with that. I'll cite numerous authorities anyway, but I'll claim to cite them somewhat freely, as though on my own 2 feet, in agreement with them. So Leo Strauss says when we're doing something like this, it's expressionistic. He uses the word expressionistic, and he says that means that there's probably something disgraceful or lacking in it, but we admit that, and we're just trying to go on some new territory. So my view is, Goethe speaks of the joys of personality. My view is that in the origin of the West, and we've had this obsession with the genealogy of things already a little bit prior to Darwin, rather than the eternality of things. Possibly Kant is a place where you could see the beginning of the Kant as the beginner of the historical thinking, and then Hegel as actually carrying out this historical question of the origin of our current ideas as being received through a development. So I want to give a few typological clusters to sketch how I see what personality means. So I mentioned before in the Iliad, you have Ares. It's almost not hubris, but his sort of hate of Zeus. So Zeus is described as a mastermind. Ares is not a mastermind, but Ares is as strong as Zeus. Similarly, against what almost everyone who commentates on the Iliad says, I can see with some clarity that or at least with enough to propose it as something worthy of further reflection, that I believe that this same relationship is reflected again in the characters of Agamemnon and Achilles. So, wrongheaded, vastly wrongheaded, is the notion that Achilles was a very young man of 16 or 17, and Agamemnon was a man nearing the end of his prime, let's say in his late 40s or 50 or so. Instead, what's happening, and this is contradicted obviously by the text, because the war of Troy had been going on for more than 10 years. Achilles was not 10 years old when the war started. He was already a king, and he was the leader of the Achaeans. No, he was probably, I would say, in his 30s, if one were to hazard a guess. The point is rather the juxtaposition of the personalities. Just as it's pointed out on a similar vein that with Nestor doesn't actually say anything that's particularly intelligent, but he's simply regarded as wise because of his personality, from the immediacy of the impression he makes on one, and his strength in counsel, which means his strength in speech. That doesn't mean that he's particularly good at strategy or anything else. What's thought in the Iliad is then this contest of clusters of personalities. So this is what was and Goethe has seen this again in some way. As I just said, to reiterate, when he speaks of the joys of personalities, he speaks of this notion, like, for instance, we can illustrate this with regard to what Heidegger says about Nietzsche, where he says the will to power does not mean something like the neocons or something, the way the neocons see Leo Strauss, for instance, the way Democrats see neocons as mouthpieces of Leo Strauss, as saying will to power means you can lie and cheat and do anything and come to power or something like that. But what Heidegger says is it's more like in day-to-day life, the will to power is showing itself. So it's more like so if you take the example I was giving before about how I understand the Tao, or Taoism, if you remove the notes from the film, is it called Unlimited, something like that? So like the guy's starting to get all kinds of mental powers, and he's doing everything right, and then in the end the culmination is some kind of political power. I think he rises to political power in some way, but instead there's no question of rising to some kind of specific hierarchical power, but it's rather the joys of personality are immediate in daily life, and in the just as there's Agamemnon has more joy of personality, let's put it that way, because he's not resentful and in this conflict with some other guy. It's Achilles who's lower down and resentful, just as Ares is resentful of Zeus. So these personality types, clusters, still exist, and they're still observable. I gave some examples. I think I was probably wrong because I was just kind of stumbling with it a little bit. I think there's probably a personality type where Sam Harris and Teal are related, but I won't say one is. It's not obvious to me that one is straightforwardly superior to the other. There are cases where you can see it more straightforwardly. So I think, for example, I don't choose these personalities because I think they're particularly exemplary in any way, but just because they're so obvious and available to all of us from movies. So I think, for instance, Tom Cruise and what's his name, Matthew McConaughey. This is the same relation within a personality cluster as the relation of Agamemnon to Achilles, or Zeus to Ares. Again, I think one could see that at a higher level, more interesting level between Nixon and somebody along the lines of who's the actor? The guy in Down and Out in Beverly, Nick Nolte. Nick Nolte. There's something like that in that relationship. You could see other relationships there. So, for instance, between Nixon and Bill Clinton is something like the relationship between a higher type like Zeus and something like an Apollo type. I think these personality clusters are visible all over, although it's not available necessarily as a strict science, except to people who would have a special talent in spotting them. But I believe it could be shown to be not subjective and to, in fact, it could, because of the consequences of these personality, the way they play out, one could actually demonstrate it externally. So this way of thinking, I believe, is at the origin of the West, but it was before Plato's time, probably before, when the period came in of consciousness, prior to Draco, this period I've been describing where people started, that Aristotle in his Metaphysics, Book 10, describes, that when there started to be abuses and cynicism with regard to the old way of thinking, so that it was manipulated consciously in order to take power, so that people in power would say, I understand what these old texts mean, and they use them to their for their own murky purposes. This was observed by Aristotle to have been going on for hundreds of years already. And so there's many evidences where we can see where this transition has happened. So for instance, in the story in Iliad about the judgment of Paris, which originally had a strict religious and as a ethos argument, it had a serious power to it. The choices between fates, between Hera, the fate of the power that stayed in place, the ruler of the city, or between the fate that was chosen, the fate of Aphrodite, the fate that Paris actually chose, that wreaked havoc. But you could see that these can be shown to be embodied in actual people and in personality types. Personality is a deep subject matter that we can go in different ways. I just think of that to show some of the ambiguities and magic of it. I think of the Zizek's praise of the film Gilda in the opening scene where Rita Hayworth is asked, "Are you decent?" With of course the double meaning, "Are you dressed?" You know, she's in her room and the husband is coming in politely saying, "Are you decent?" And she says, "Me." Me? So the way she says it is very suggestive, precisely because of her personality is teetering on the edge of this both knowingness and innocence, both strength and a kind of forgetfulness. Personality shows, as is obvious in all sorts of ways, but in the delivery of lines in films, one often sees it that another actor or actress would not be able to carry off the same effect, and not only because of their looks externally, but because of their personality. Okay, so the time is running low, but I want to try to deepen this notion as we go along, and I think it plays a powerful role still in the being we're placed into right now, and it has a connection to everything we've been discussing about the ideas in the cave and so forth.